What happens when the person sworn to protect you becomes the monster you must escape? In the unforgiving heart of the 1870s American West, a young woman named Esther is about to learn that the most dangerous frontier isn't the land, but the human heart. She was cast out, abandoned to the sun, and circling vultures by her own father, left with a secret he would kill to keep buried. But her story wasn't meant to end in the dust. It was destined to be rewritten by the most unlikely of saviors, a Comanche warrior who would find more than a dying girl, but a spirit that would change his own path forever. This is the story of a brutal betrayal, an impossible rescue, and the birth of a legend. The sun was a merciless gold in the Texas panhandle, a searing white eye in an endless canvas of bleached blue. For 17-year-old Esther, it had become a personal tormentor. Every ray that struck the canvas cover of their wagon felt like a hammer blow, every shimmer on the horizon a cruel mirage. For 3 days they had seen nothing but cracked earth, skeletal mesquite trees, and the occasional wary lizard. Her father, Jedediah Thorne, sat beside her on the driver's bench, his profile as hard and unforgiving as the land itself. He was a man carved from hardship, his face a road map of sun-scorched lines, his eyes the color of faded denim, and just as empty. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since they'd left the last dusty outpost of civilization, a place called Prairie Dog Town Fork. "Almost there, Ellie." He'd grunted that morning, the words cracking like dry leaves. "The deeds for a plot of land just beyond the Cimarron. Rich soil," he said. "A new start for us." Esther had simply nodded her throat, too dry for a proper response. A new start. The words had been their mantra since her mother, Seraphina, had succumbed to the lung fever that winter. Jedediah had sold their small, struggling farm in Missouri almost overnight, packed their meager belongings into a single wagon, and pointed them southwest. He was chasing a ghost. She thought the ghost of prosperity, a phantom that had always eluded him. But something about this final leg of the journey felt different. The urgency had turned frantic, the silence more profound. He'd pushed the horses' 2 weary geldings named Cain and Abel past their limits. He barely ate, and she saw the way his eyes darted towards the horizon, not with hope, but with a hunter's vigilance. Late in the afternoon, under the oppressive weight of the heat, one of the wagon wheels finally gave in. The crack of the axle was sharp and final, like a bone snapping. The wagon lurched violently, tipping to one side and sending a cascade of their possessions tumbling onto the parched earth. Esther was thrown from her seat, landing hard on her shoulder. Jedediah cursed, a venomous, guttural sound that startled the horses. He leaped down, his movements stiff with rage, and kicked the broken wheel. "Father, are you all right?" Esther asked, pushing herself up, wincing as pain shot through her arm. He ignored her. He stared at the shattered axle, then at the setting sun, which was beginning to bleed orange and purple across the western sky. A strange calmness settled over him, a cold stillness that frightened Esther more than his anger. "The wagon's finished," he said, his voice flat. "We can't fix it here. So we wait. Someone will come along, surely," she said, though she knew as well as he that they hadn't seen another soul for days. Jedediah turned to her, and for the first time she saw something other than grief or frustration in his eyes. It was a look of chilling calculation. "No. I'll go on. Travel faster on my own. I'll get to the settlement and bring back help." A knot of ice formed in Esther's stomach. "On your own. But what about me, the horses?" "The horses are spent. Can't risk taking them," he said, walking to the back of the wagon. He rummaged through their supplies, pulling out a single water skin and a small sack of hardtack. He then unstrapped his own rifle, checking the chamber. "You'll stay here. Guard the wagon. There's enough water for a day, maybe 2 if you're smart about it. I should be back by then." The logic was a thin, brittle veneer over something ugly and wrong. Leave her alone. In the middle of this wasteland, the coyotes would be howling soon, their calls echoing in the vast, empty dark. "No." Esther said the word barely a whisper. She took a step closer to him. "Father, please. Don't. I can walk. I'll keep up. We stay together. It's what Mother would have wanted." The mention of her mother was a mistake. Jedediah's face contorted a mask of pure, undiluted spite. He turned on her, his voice dropping to a low, menacing hiss. "Your mother." He spat the words dripping with a poison she had never heard before. "Your mother is the reason we're in this hell. Her weakness, her secrets." "Secrets? What are you talking about?" Esther's heart hammered against her ribs. He laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "You think you're my blood. You think a thorn has soft brown eyes like a doe. You think I don't see him every time I look at you." Esther recoiled as if struck. The words made no sense yet. They hit her with the force of a physical blow. Him who? Silas Croft. Jedediah snarled the name, tasting like ash in his mouth. A traveling merchant with a silver tongue and no morals. He passed through our town a year before you were born. Your mother, your sainted Seraphina, found comfort in his arms while I was away, breaking my back on a cattle drive. The world tilted on its axis. The heat, the thirst, the broken wagon, it all faded into a roaring in her ears. This couldn't be true. Her mother had been the kindest, gentlest soul she had ever known. "You're lying," she choked out. "You're mad from the sun." "Am I?" He took a menacing step forward, his shadow falling over her as the sun dipped below the horizon. "I found her letters to him after she died. Buried them in a little box under a floorboard. She was going to leave me. Take you with her. Her precious little memory of Silas." He paused, his eyes glinting. "I made sure he never came back for you. A dispute over a card game, the sheriff ruled it. A man has a right to defend his honor." The implication was horrifyingly clear. He hadn't just hated this Silas Croft. He had murdered him. And Esther was the living evidence of the betrayal, a secret he had been forced to carry for 17 years. This journey wasn't about a new start. It was about an end. Her end. "All this way," she breathed, the full, crushing weight of his deception settling upon her. "This was never about a new life." "It is," he corrected, his voice devoid of all emotion. "For me." He tossed the small water skin and the sack of biscuits at her feet. They landed in the dust with a soft thud. He didn't even look at her again. He untied Abel, the stronger of the 2 horses, from the wagon harness, swung himself onto its bare back, and kicked its sides. "Father!" She screamed, the sound raw and desperate. She stumbled after him, her hand outstretched. "Jedediah, don't do this. Please." He didn't turn back. He didn't slow down. He just rode into the deepening twilight, a solitary figure shrinking against the vast, indifferent landscape, leaving her alone with the broken wagon, the dying light, and the terrible, soul-shattering truth. Esther stood there until the sound of hoofbeats faded to nothing, swallowed by the immense silence of the plains. She was not Esther Thorne. She was the daughter of a murdered man, abandoned to die by her mother's killer. The last sliver of the sun disappeared, plunging the world into a cold, star-dusted darkness. She sank to her knees, the sob that ripped from her throat lost in the rising wail of a distant coyote. She was utterly and completely alone. The night did not fall. It consumed. One moment, the sky was a bruise of purple and orange. The next it was an infinite, star-pricked blackness. The warmth of the day fled the earth as if it had never been, leaving a deep, penetrating cold that seeped into Esther's bones. She remained on her knees in the dust, the position she had collapsed into, when the last echo of Jedediah's horse had vanished. The dust was cool now, almost damp, and it clung to the tear tracks on her cheeks. For a time she couldn't measure she was nothing but a vessel for the pain. It wasn't the sharp, clean pain of a cut, but a deep internal tearing. Every memory of the man she had called father was now poisoned. His rare smiles, the way he'd taught her to tie a fisherman's knot, the gruff approval in his voice when she'd learned to load the old rifle, it was all a lie, a performance. He had been acting a part for 17 years, and the final curtain had fallen, leaving her stranded in the ruins of the stage. The howling of the coyotes grew closer, a chorus of yips and mournful cries that seemed to mock her solitude. Fear, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the fog of her grief. She scrambled back towards the crippled wagon, her movements clumsy and frantic. The hulking shape of it, tipped onto its side, offered the only solid presence in the vast emptiness. It was a tombstone for the life she thought she had. She huddled against the overturned wagon bed, pulling her thin shawl tight around her shoulders. The remaining horse, Cain, whinnied softly, a nervous sound. He was her only living companion, and the sound was a small comfort. She listened to his heavy breathing, the shuffle of his hooves in the dirt, and matched her own breaths to his, a fragile rhythm in the overwhelming silence. Sleep was impossible. Every time her eyes drifted shut, she saw Jedediah's face, the cold calculation in his eyes. She saw her mother, Seraphina, her gentle smile now shadowed by a secret she had carried to her grave. And she saw the ghost of a man named Silas Croft, a man whose face she could not imagine, but whose death was now inextricably linked to her own existence. Was she a product of love or of shame? A secret her mother cherished, or a burden she longed to escape? The questions were a swarm of angry bees in her mind, each one stinging more painfully than the last. She drank from the water skin Jedediah had thrown her a single miserly sip. The water was lukewarm and tasted of leather, but it was moisture. It was life. She tried one of the hardtack biscuits, but her throat was too tight with unshed tears, and the dry crumbs felt like swallowing sand. She saved it, wrapping it carefully back in its sack. The night wore on, an eternity of cold and fear. The stars, unobscured by the lights of any town or campfire, were a brilliant, terrifying spectacle. They were not friendly lights, but cold, distant diamonds, scattered across black velvet, indifferent to her suffering. They had watched over this land for millennia, had seen countless lives begin and end beneath their gaze. Hers, she thought, would be just one more. Dawn arrived, not with a gentle blush, but with a stark grey light that slowly crept over the horizon, revealing the landscape in all its desolate reality. The world was shades of brown and grey, the skeletal trees like charcoal sketches against the pale sky. With the light came a new awareness, the gnawing in her belly, the sandpaper roughness of her tongue, the dull, persistent ache in her shoulder where she had fallen. Survival was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical demand. Grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had to move. She had to think. Slowly, stiffly, she rose to her feet. Her first thought was for Cain. The poor animal was tied to the wreckage, his head hanging low. She found the last of their oats spilled from a ripped sack and poured a small pile into her hands. He nudged her palm gratefully, his warm breath ghosting across her skin. While he ate, she checked the wagon's water barrel. It was tipped on its side, and a dark, damp patch in the dirt told her most of its contents had been lost. But by rocking it carefully, she heard a faint sloshing. Tilting it with all her might, she managed to collect another 2 water skins worth before it ran completely dry. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Her gaze fell upon the wreckage of their belongings, scattered across the ground. A cast-iron skillet, a bag of flour ripped open, and spilling white dust, a few changes of clothes, her mother's sewing box. It was the sewing box that drew her. It had been one of the few things Jedediah had allowed her to bring, muttering something about a woman's work. She knelt and lifted the simple wooden box. The latch was loose. Inside, nestled amongst spools of thread and packets of needles, was a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped it. It wasn't thread or fabric. It was a small, tattered book, a journal, its leather cover worn smooth with handling. Her mother's journal. And tucked inside the front cover was a faded daguerreotype. It was of a young man with a kind, open face, dark hair that curled slightly at his temples, and intelligent, smiling eyes. He wasn't handsome in the rugged way of frontiersmen, but in a softer, more refined way. He looked like a man who read books and knew things about the world beyond the horizon. He was looking not at the artist, but slightly to the side, as if at someone who had just made him laugh. Written in faint ink at the bottom were 2 words: Silas. My Silas. This was him, her father, her real father. A man who smiled. The sight of him, the reality of him, broke through her carefully constructed dam of practicality. A sob caught in her throat. She wasn't just the evidence of a betrayal. She was the legacy of a love affair. A love that Jedediah had tried to erase from the world with a bullet and a lie. Tucking the photograph safely inside her dress against her heart, she opened the journal. Her mother's script was elegant, a series of delicate loops and swirls. Most of it was mundane notes about planting remedies for coughs, the price of cotton. But as Esther turned the pages, she found passages where the ink was darker, the words more rushed, more passionate. Silas passed through today. He brought silks from the east and stories that make my heart ache for a world I shall never see. When he speaks, I feel as though the sun has come out from behind a cloud, and later, a passage that made Esther's breath catch. Jedediah is a good man, a hard worker, but his heart is as hard as the soil he tills. There is no poetry in him. With Silas, every word is a poem. He sees me, the real me. I fear I am losing myself. And then the final damning entry from nearly 18 years ago. I carry Silas's child, a secret joy and a terrible terror. He will return for us in the spring. He has promised. We will go to California, he says, where the ocean meets the sky. I must be brave, for my child, for our future. He had meant to come back. He hadn't abandoned them. Jedediah had lied about everything. He hadn't just murdered a rival. He had murdered her mother's hope. He had stolen her future. A new emotion began to smolder beneath the grief and fear rage. A cold, hard anger that gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. Jedediah had not just left her to die. He had tried to kill her spirit, to erase her very identity. She would not let him. Clutching the journal, she stood up. The sun was higher now, its heat beginning to bite. She looked to the east, the direction from which they had come. It was a fool's hope days of walking back to nothing. She looked to the west where Jedediah had gone. Towards the settlement, he'd said. Towards his new life. Her life would not end here. She did not know how she would survive, but she knew she would. She owed it to the smiling man in the photograph and the woman who had dreamed of the ocean. She was not Esther Thorne, a cast-off burden. She was Esther Croft, the daughter of a man with poetry in his soul, and her story was not over. She gathered the water skins, the small sack of hardtack, and her mother's journal. She untied Cain from the wagon, his presence a steadying warmth at her side. With one last look at the ruined wagon, she turned her back on it and began to walk. She did not walk west towards Jedediah. She walked south away from his path, away from the past he had invented for her. She was walking into the unknown, with only a ghost for a father and a burning rage to keep her warm. To walk south was an act of pure defiance. It was a direction without a destination, a line drawn against the one Jedediah had followed. Each step Esther took was a deliberate, painful reclamation of her own life. The rage that had propelled her away from the wagon was a fire in her belly, but the sun was a greater fire in the sky, and it quickly began to bake the anger into a brittle shell of desperation. The land was an ocean of pale, straw-colored grass that rolled in hypnotic waves with every gust of wind. The horizon was a perfect unbroken circle, and she was the dead center of it. There were no landmarks, no friendly hills or distant mountains to aim for, only the merciless sun climbing higher on her left and the slow westward crawl of her own shadow. She led Cain by his rope, the leather digging into her palm. His steady, plodding gait was the only rhythm in her world, a 4-beat measure against the sighing of the wind. "We just have to keep moving, Cain," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. The horse flicked an ear back, a small acknowledgement that made her feel fractionally less alone. She spoke to him often, her words swallowed by the vastness. She told him about her mother's journal, about the man with the smiling eyes, about the stolen dream of California. The horse, of course, did not understand, but his warm, solid presence beside her was an anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. By midday, the heat was a physical weight. It pressed down on her head and shoulders, shimmered in the air before her, and radiated back up from the baked earth. The landscape, which had seemed so empty, was alive with a million tiny sounds she'd never noticed before. The frantic buzzing of insects, the rustle of unseen things in the grass, the high, lonesome cry of a hawk circling miles above. Each sound was a reminder of life that was adapted to this place, life to which she was a fragile, unwelcome intruder. She rationed the water with a discipline born of terror. A single sip every hour, just enough to wet her tongue and throat before the dryness returned with a vengeance. The hardtack biscuit she ate tasted of dust and despair, but she forced it down, knowing the meager strength it offered was all she had. Her thoughts became disjointed, a fever-dream collage of past and present. She would see her mother's face not as the frail woman in a sickbed, but as the young woman from the journal, her heart secretly full of a love that defied her hard life. Esther would picture Seraphina sewing by candlelight, her needle flying while her mind was miles away, dreaming of a man who brought stories of the world. Then the image would shatter, replaced by Jedediah's face, his eyes cold and empty as a winter sky. He had slept under the same roof, eaten at the same table, all while nursing a viper of hatred in his heart. How could she have lived so close to such a monster and never seen it? The guilt of her own blindness was a fresh torment. The photograph of Silas Croft, tucked inside her dress, felt warm against her skin. It was a talisman, a fragile proof that she was not an accident, but the product of a love so powerful, her mother had risked everything for it. She would pull it out sometimes, her hands shaking, and study his face. She searched his features for a hint of herself, the curve of his mouth, the intelligence in his eyes. She was his daughter. The thought was both a comfort and a profound sorrow. She was the only thing left of him, a living ghost in a dying land. Late in the afternoon, her hope began to fray. The initial burst of defiant energy had burned away, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion in her muscles and a hollow dread in her soul. Her shoulder throbbed with a persistent, dull pain. The sun began its slow descent in front of her, painting the endless scion shades of gold and rose. It was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a predator, a prelude to the killing cold of another night. She stumbled her boot, catching on a root, and fell to her knees. Cain stopped beside her, nudging her sore shoulder with his nose. For a long moment, she didn't have the strength to get up. The thought of simply lying there, of letting the vast, indifferent sky swallow her, was a seductive whisper. It would be so easy to stop, so easy to let go. But then she felt the hard outline of the journal pressed against her ribs. She thought of her mother's final entry. I must be brave. For my child. For our future. A future Jedediah had tried to steal. A future she was now living, breath by painful breath. With a ragged cry that was half sob, half curse, she pushed herself back up. Her legs trembled, but they held. She could not give up. Giving up meant he won. It meant her mother's love and Silas's life meant nothing. As she took another step, something on the ground caught her eye. It was out of place in the uniform sea of grass. A track. Not the familiar print of a deer or coyote. It was larger, unshod. The track of a single horse heading southwest. It was recent. The edges were still sharp, not yet softened by the wind. Someone else was out here. A jolt of adrenaline, a mixture of hope and terror shot through her. A traveler. A hunter or something else. Jedediah had always spoken of the Comanche with a fear that bordered on hatred, calling them savages, ghosts of the plains. He said they could appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Her heart pounded in her chest. She looked around wildly, but the horizon was as empty as ever. Was she being watched? Was the rider ahead of her or behind her? The track was a single silent thread of evidence in an otherwise empty world, and it changed everything. She was no longer just fighting the land. She was a player in a game whose rules she did not know, with an opponent she could not see. She clutched the rope tethering Cain, her knuckles white. She had a choice. Follow the track, hoping it led to help, or veer away, fearing it led to danger. With the sun now touching the horizon and the prospect of another night alone, the decision was made for her. Any sign of humanity, even a potentially hostile one, was better than the crushing certainty of solitude. Holding her breath, she turned her path slightly, aligning her steps with the faint prints in the dust, walking toward as a fate she could not possibly imagine. The world dissolved into a palette of deepening reds and bruised purples. Following the tracks of the unshod horse became an exercise in faith as the hoof prints faded into the growing shadows. Esther's world had shrunk to the few feet of ground, illuminated by the last vestiges of daylight. Her every sense was strained, listening for any sound over the thudding of her own heart and the whisper of the wind. Cain walked so close behind her that his breath was a warm, damp presence on her neck, a constant living reminder that she was not entirely alone in her folly. The cold returned swifter and more biting than the night before. It felt personal, a thief stealing the last of her strength. Her shoulder was no longer just an ache. It was a hot, searing agony that pulsed with every step. Her thirst had become a living thing, a clawing creature in her throat. The sips of water from the skin were a brief, mocking reprieve. Her mind, starved of water and rest, began to play tricks on her. She saw figures in the distance that dissolved into swaying grass when she focused. She heard voices on the wind fragments of her mother's lullabies, mingling with Jedediah's venomous curses. She clutched the daguerreotype of Silas Croft through her dress, the small, hard rectangle, a point of focus in the swirling delirium. "I must be brave." The words were a fraying rope she clung to, swinging over a chasm of despair. The tracks led her toward a shallow depression in the plains, a place where the grass grew slightly thicker. It offered no real shelter, but it was a change in the monotonous landscape. It was here, as the last light of dusk gave way to the profound darkness of the plains, that her body finally betrayed her. One moment she was walking, her feet moving with a mechanical leaden rhythm. The next her vision swam with black spots. The ground tilted violently and her legs simply ceased to hold her. There was no cry, no time to even register the fall. She collapsed in a heap, the impact jarring the breath from her lungs. The leather rope slipped from her limp fingers. The world went silent, then dark. She floated in a timeless, painless void. It was not unpleasant. It was a release from the pain, the fear, the crushing weight of memory. But something pulled at her, a faint, rhythmic sound. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of an approaching horse, slow and deliberate. Consciousness returned not as a rush, but as a slow, seeping tide. She was aware of the cold ground beneath her cheek, the scent of dust and dry grass. Her eyelids were heavy, glued shut. The thumping sound was closer now. It stopped. Silence descended, thick and watchful. She held her breath, a primal instinct screaming that she was prey. She heard a soft sound, the creak of leather, a footfall light on the earth, then another. Someone was standing over her. Terror, stark and absolute, lanced through the fog in her mind. This was it. The savage from Jedediah's stories, the faceless ghost of the plains. She tried to move, to scream, but her body was a leaden weight, her throat sealed shut. A shadow fell across her face, blocking out the faint starlight. She felt a presence kneeling beside her. She expected a rough hand, a killing blow. Instead, she felt a gentle touch on her forehead, surprisingly cool. The hand was firm, calloused, but there was no violence in it. It brushed the matted hair from her face, then rested for a moment on her neck, feeling for the faint, thready pulse. With an immense effort that cost her everything, Esther forced her eyes open. They would not focus. All she could see was a shape, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. The shape of a man. He was broad-shouldered, with long hair that fell past his shoulders. The starlight caught the glint of something in his hair, a single feather. He shifted, and she heard the sound of water being unstopped from a skin. He gently, carefully lifted her head. Her own water skin was empty. She'd drained the last drops hours ago. This was his. He brought the lip of the skin to her cracked mouth. The water was cool and clean, the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. It wasn't a sip. He let her drink a slow, steady trickle that soothed the fire in her throat. She swallowed greedily, weakly, the simple act of survival, overriding her fear. When he pulled the water skin away, her eyes had focused enough to see his face. It was not the monstrous visage of her nightmares. It was a man's face, strong and angular, with high cheekbones and a stern mouth. His skin was the color of rich earth, his eyes dark and deep-set. They were not cruel eyes. They were watchful, intelligent, and held a gravity that seemed as old as the plains themselves. He looked from her to the weary, lame form of Cain, who stood passively a few feet away. He saw her tattered dress, her sunburnt face, the desperation that clung to her like dust. His expression did not change, but she felt his gaze take in everything, understanding her plight in a single, silent assessment. This was a Comanche, a warrior named Nocona, though she would not know his name for some time. But in that moment, hovering on the knife's edge between life and death, she did not see an enemy. She saw the man who had followed his own tracks back to find what his instincts told him should not be there. She saw the man who was giving her water. She saw the shape in the dusk, and for the first time in days, it was not the shape of death, but the faint, terrifying, and unmistakable shape of hope. The water did more than quench her thirst. It was an anchor, pulling her back from the silent, drifting void into the sharp reality of the living world. Esther lay on the cold ground, the earth leaching warmth from her bones, her head now resting on her own thin pack placed there by the silent man. Consciousness returned not in a rush, but in painful, fragmented waves, the throbbing fire in her shoulder, the raw sandpaper texture of her tongue, the deep, hollow ache of starvation in her belly. She watched him move, and it was like watching a force of nature. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was mesmerizing, a fluid economy of motion that spoke of a life lived in perfect, brutal tune with the rhythms of the land. There were no wasted gestures, no hesitation. Each action was imbued with a deep, instinctual purpose she could not yet comprehend. He rose and walked to his own horse, a muscular pinto, whose hide seemed to absorb the starlight, leaving it a shifting pattern of shadow and darker shadow. The horse stood utterly still, a testament to its master's discipline. From a pouch on his saddle, the man retrieved a small leather bundle before returning to her side. He knelt again, the movement as silent as a hawk settling on a branch. From the pouch he took a small, hard strip of dried buffalo meat. He offered it to her, his hand steady in the gloom. Esther stared at it. A hunger so fierce, it was a physical pain clawed at her insides, demanding she snatch it and tear at it with her teeth. But a lifetime of warnings of Jedediah's hateful, fearful stories whispered around the fire paralyzed her. Savages. Killers. They trust no one, and no one should trust them. The words were a ghostly chorus in her mind. Her fear for a moment was stronger than her hunger. The man's dark eyes, deep-set and unreadable, met hers. He seemed to understand the war raging within her. There was no impatience in his gaze, only a calm, steady watchfulness that saw right through her terror to the desperate, dying creature beneath. Without breaking his gaze, he broke off a tiny piece of the jerky and put it in his own mouth, chewing slowly, deliberately. It was a gesture of profound reassurance, a communication that transcended language, an answer to the question she hadn't dared to ask. It is safe. The act shattered her paralysis. Slowly, as if lifting a leaden weight, she reached out a trembling hand and took the offered meat. Her fingers brushed his, and his skin was calloused and warm. The salty, smoky flavor exploded in her mouth, so intense and overwhelmingly rich it almost made her gag. The meat was tough, and chewing it was an act of profound effort that sent jolts of pain through her jaw. But with each agonizingly slow bite, she felt a flicker of life of warmth returning to her limbs. It was more than food. It was strength. It was defiance. It was a choice to live. He watched her eat, his expression as unchanging as the stone outcrops of the plains, then turned his attention to her injured shoulder. Before she could process his intent, he gently took hold of her arm. A spark of pure animal terror made her flinch violently, her muscles tensing to pull away. But his grip, for all its strength, was surprisingly gentle, a firm hold that was not a threat, but a promise of stillness. She knew struggling was useless. With deft fingers that seemed impossibly nimble for their size, he tore a clean strip from the hem of her worn dress. He then opened another small pouch, this one emitting a pungent, earthy smell of yarrow and sage, a scent of the wild earth itself. He mixed a pinch of the dark herbal powder it contained with a few drops of water from his skin, creating a thick, dark paste on the back of his hand. His gaze lifted to hers again, and this time it was not a statement, but a question. It asked for a trust she had no reason to give, yet had no choice but to grant. Esther, caught in the chasm between her ingrained fear and the undeniable evidence of his care, could only give a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He carefully, impersonally eased the tattered fabric of her dress away from her shoulder. In the dim light, she saw the angry, swollen flesh, the dark bruise that had blossomed there like a poisonous flower. His touch, when it came, was clinical. He applied the cool paste to the injury, and the searing, fiery pain that had been her constant companion began to subside almost instantly into a dull, manageable throb. The relief was so sudden, so profound, it stole her breath and brought fresh tears to her eyes. But these were not tears of grief or terror. They were tears of bewildered, shattering gratitude. He finished his work securing the torn strip of her dress as a makeshift bandage. Through it all, he had not spoken a single word. His actions spoke a language more powerful, more honest than any she knew, a language of competence, of survival, of an unexpected and inexplicable compassion that her world had never prepared her for. His assessment then turned to Cain. He walked over to her horse, a dark shape against the endless stars. Cain whinnied softly, a sound of pain and fear. The man began to run his hands down the animal's legs, his touch firm and knowing. He felt the swollen joints, the heat of the inflammation. He lifted Cain's hoof, examining it closely in the faint starlight. Esther watched her heart, a cold stone in her chest. That horse, as weary and broken as he was her last link to her past, the last living thing that had known her before her world had shattered. He was a piece of a life she now knew was a lie. But he was real. The man looked back at Esther, and for the first time, his expression shifted into something she could clearly understand, a quiet, somber finality. It was the look of a man who understands death, who knows its necessity and its weight. He shook his head slowly, a single decisive gesture. The message needed no words. He cannot make the journey. A wave of sorrow, sharp and deep, washed over Esther. A sob caught in her throat, but she swallowed it down. On these plains, she was beginning to understand tears were a waste of water. She saw the brutal, unsparing logic. Sentiment was a weight that could drown you. She gave a single, slow nod of acceptance, her throat tight, sealing the poor animal's fate. It felt like a final betrayal, but it was also her first true act of survival. The man Nokona gathered his few things. With a strength that seemed effortless, he lifted her to her feet. She swayed her legs, refusing to hold her, and his arm came around her back, a solid, steadying presence. He led her to his pinto, and with one smooth, powerful motion, lifted her and placed her on its back, sitting her sideways like a child. He swung up behind her, his body a shield against the cold night wind that whipped across the plains. He did not touch her again, but she was acutely aware of his presence, of the heat radiating from him, of the sheer solid reality of him. He nudged the pinto forward with a soft sound, leaving Cain standing alone in the darkness. Esther did not look back. She couldn't bear it. She leaned her head against the warrior's broad back, the scent of leather horse dust and the strange earthy poultice filling her senses. She felt the hard outline of her mother's journal and the daguerreotype of Silas Croft pressed against her. One was a history of secret love, the other its ghost. She was riding into an unknown future, into the heart of the territory her people feared, carried by a man she should have seen as her mortal enemy. He was a stranger who had saved her, a savage who had shown her more kindness than her own father. As the pinto moved with a steady, ground-eating rhythm into the vast, star-dusted night, Esther finally surrendered to the exhaustion. Her last conscious thought was not of fear, but of a strange, terrifying and profound sense of peace. Her life was no longer her own, and in that surrender she found the first true chance of survival. The ride was a dream of motion and darkness. Esther drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the steady rhythm of the horse and the solid presence behind her. When she finally woke, it was to a world of new sounds and smells. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke roasting meat and the unfamiliar aroma of damp hides. The singular silence of the plains had been replaced by a low hum of activity. The distant laughter of children, the barking of dogs, the soft murmur of voices speaking a language that flowed like water over stones. Nokona slid from the horse and lifted her down. Her legs buckled, and he held her steady for a moment, before an older woman with a face like a beautiful wrinkled map and eyes full of sharp intelligence emerged from a nearby teepee. She and Nokona spoke in low, quick tones. The woman's gaze swept over Esther, taking in her tattered clothes and pale face, but there was no pity in it, only assessment. She beckoned Esther with a slight nod of her head. This was his mother, Cedar Woman, and in the weeks that followed, she became Esther's keeper. It was a life stripped to its essentials. She learned to scrape hides, to find edible roots to sew with an awl and sinew. Language was the biggest barrier, a wall she chipped away at every day. She learned words through gestures: Hobi, for moccasin; Pia, for mother; Tuhbi, for son. And she learned Nokona's name. She saw him often, but from a distance. He was a respected warrior, a provider. She would watch him teaching the young boys to shoot arrows, his movements patient and precise. Sometimes their eyes would meet across the bustling camp, a brief, silent acknowledgement that held the memory of the night he'd found her. In this new world, she was no longer the daughter of Jedediah Thorne or Silas Croft. She was simply Tuhbi Poko, the one found in the sun, a strange girl with quiet hands and haunted eyes. She kept her mother's journal hidden, a secret relic of a world that felt a lifetime away. One afternoon, months after her arrival, a rider entered the camp, his horse lathered. He brought news from the white settlements. A man named Jedediah Thorne had been telling a tale of horror, his daughter stolen in a brutal raid by Comanche savages. He had gathered a posse of rangers fueled by whiskey and righteousness to reclaim what was his and exact vengeance. A cold dread, a feeling she thought she had left behind in the dust, gripped Esther. It was happening. The past was coming for her. 3 days later they appeared on the horizon, a line of riders' sunlight glinting off their rifle barrels. They stopped at the edge of the camp, a stark intrusion of another world. At their head was Jedediah. He looked older, his face gaunt and twisted with a fanatic's fire, but his eyes were the same as cold and unforgiving as she remembered. Nokona and the other warriors gathered their faces, grim weapons in hand. Cedar Woman pulled Esther behind her, a protective shield. "Esther!" Jedediah's voice boomed across the clearing, a sound that made her flinch. "I've come for you. Come out from behind those heathens." He saw her then, standing half-hidden, her hair, now longer, her skin browned by the sun, wearing a simple deerskin dress. His face contorted with rage. "Look what they've done to you. You're living like an animal." Slowly, Esther stepped out from behind Cedar Woman. She stood tall, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her resolve a fire in her heart. "They did nothing to me," she called out, her voice clearer and stronger than she expected. "They saved me." "Saved you?" Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "From what I was coming back for you." "Liar!" Esther said the word, cutting through the tense silence. She took a step forward, then another, until she stood in the open space between the two groups. "You left me to die. You left me in the desert because you couldn't stand to look at my face, because it reminded you that my mother loved another man." A shocked murmur went through the posse. Jedediah's face turned ashen. "It's the sun sickness talking. The savages have twisted your mind. My mind has never been clearer," Esther said, her voice ringing with the force of absolute truth. She pulled the daguerreotype from a pouch at her waist. "This is my father, Silas Croft, a man you murdered and buried with your lies." She looked directly at the other riders. "This man is not a grieving father. He is a killer who abandoned his wife's child to the vultures to hide his own shame. He didn't come here for me. He came to Slant's, the last witness to his crime." The posse stared first at the fury and desperation on Jedediah's face, then at the unwavering conviction on Esther's. They saw the Comanche not as a horde of attackers, but as a silent, watchful group, standing behind a woman they had clearly taken in. They saw the truth. Jedediah, exposed and cornered, finally broke. He raised his rifle, his eyes wild with madness. "You ungrateful whelp! I'll send you to hell myself!" But before he could fire an arrow, swift and silent, as death flew from the Comanche line and embedded itself in his shoulder. He screamed, dropping the rifle. It was Nokona's arrow. He hadn't aimed to kill, but to disarm, to end the threat. The fight went out of the posse. They looked at Jedediah, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his monstrous soul laid bare for all to see. With disgust, their leader spat on the ground and turned his horse. "He's your problem now," he grunted, and one by one the rangers rode away, leaving Jedediah Thorne alone, a pathetic, defeated figure. Esther stood watching them go, the last threads of her old life finally snapping. When she turned back, her eyes found Nokona. He was looking at her, and for the first time she saw a clear emotion in his eyes, a deep, quiet respect. Her past was a story of lies and murder. But here in this place of new beginnings, she was not defined by the man who tried to erase her. She was defined by her own resilience, by the people who had saved her, and by the choice she had made. She was Tuhbi-Poko, the one found in the sun, and for the first time standing under the vast open sky of the Comanche area, she was finally home. Esther's journey into the dust was meant to be her end, but it became her beginning. Betrayed by blood, she was rescued by a man from a world she was taught to hate. She found a new path written in a language of sense and survival, and when her past returned for vengeance, she faced it not with fear, but with the truth. Esther's story is a powerful reminder that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we find, and that our truest identity is forged in the choices we make. If Esther's story of survival, courage, and rebirth moved you, please help us share it with the world. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps us keep telling these epic tales. Thank you for watching.